It was late one snowy Christmas Eve in Loudoun County, Virginia. Frank had just hitched two of Mr. Sullivan's horses to the carriage and was quietly guiding them toward the gate. The snow had already covered the stony path, but he had no trouble finding his way. He had done this hundreds of times before. But this was the first time that Frank's master didn't know that he was doing it. Frank was about to run away. Hi, my name is Jeremy, and welcome to Elwin Studios. Frank Wanzer was a slave under Luther Sullivan, a man that he described to be the very meanest in all of Virginia, and it was quite possibly true. Mr. Sullivan was very careful not to overfeed any of his slaves, instead taking the food that would probably be theirs and turning it into a profit. But what he withheld in food, he made up for with the whip. Frank's mother was beaten once with this whip, but that was a long time ago. 4 years, in fact. Frank's mother and two of his siblings were sold south to pay off a debt. There had been at least 24 others that Frank knew of who were sold and who met the same fate in the South. Despite Mr. Sullivan's shrewd dealings with his money, the creditors kept coming. And that is why Frank is out in the cold, in the dead of winter, missing Christmas Eve dinner with his sister and her husband. He couldn't stand the thought of being sent south. There were stories of people who were sent south healthy, strong, but when they went into the cotton fields, they couldn't last more than a day. Frank would not let this be his fate. He was at the edge of the path now. He slowly pulled the latch on the gate and pushed it open. The thoughts in his mind must have been ones of terror. Somebody's awake in the house. Somebody's behind you. They're looking. Maybe you should turn back. They hear you. What was that sound? No, he had to keep those thoughts out of his mind. He quickly got on the carriage and then got the horses to move onto the road and then up away from his plantation. He had to be careful not to rouse the horses on the couple-mile journey, but he finally did stop in front of Townsend McVee's farm. And when he did, he got out, looked over to the side where the trees were on the opposite end of the road, but he couldn't see anything. They must have been late. There was nothing for Frank to do now but wait. The snow had finally slowed down, but the winds were keeping up. So in order to stay warm, Frank started pacing between the woods and his wagon. He was generally more patient than other 25-year-olds, but this operation relied on speed, though Elizabeth wasn't really one to keep time. Frank had grown up with the Foster sisters and knew them quite well. Mary Elizabeth was a full year younger than him, but had married a man who was 26 years old, named Barnaby Grigby. He was a slave on another plantation, and just like Frank, he had quite a bit of European blood in him. Frank got along very well with the couple. Barnaby was a very hard worker and far more intelligent than his master gave him credit for. And Frank loved spending time with them, even though Barnaby was a bit more quiet. But more than this, Frank loved to spend time with Emily. She was the younger of the two sisters by a full 2 years. She was resourceful, bold, and very smart. There was not much that she could do to annoy Frank, which was a good thing, since she was his fiancée. The snow had completely stopped, but the Fosters were still nowhere in sight. Frank was now pacing in a lane that he unintentionally dug for himself in the snow. He finally looked up at the moon, but he couldn't see it. Couldn't see the stars either. Then he heard the hoot of a barn owl, a very clumsy hoot. He responded with another hoot, and moments later was greeted by the sisters. Apparently, they had discovered that it was easier to hide the pistol of their master rather than his hunting rifle. Emily opened up a sack to reveal Mr. McVee's beautiful double-barreled pistol. Frank helped the sisters onto the carriage and got up himself. Then they were on the move again. A little more quickly this time, because there were a few others that were waiting for them. 3 other men, in fact, one of which was Elizabeth's husband. Each of them had brought a few other provisions, and in the end they tallied 4 horses, 6 pistols, a few knives, and enough food for each of them and the horses for a day. It was now Christmas morning. Frank was tired, but not tired enough to wake Barnaby and Elizabeth up yet. Emily was sitting at his side singing a Christmas hymn, and the 2 other men were trailing behind, also extremely tired from the night ride. They had traveled more than 100 miles and were now in the state of Maryland. A couple more days of traveling like this, and they would be free soon. But it was daylight now. Frank looked around and he couldn't find any place for them to hide the carriage to rest. So they had to keep going and travel by daylight and hide and rest and sleep in the cover of darkness. But their presence during the day couldn't be more obvious. 6 poorly dressed blacks riding 4 horses that were very well bred on a nice carriage as well. Frank knew that anybody that saw them would definitely know what they were up to. So Frank was just glad that it was Christmas Day and everyone was probably still in their homes. Barnaby and Elizabeth woke up to find that they were in a completely new environment. No farms. They were along a beautiful river that hadn't iced over yet, but everything else was almost all snow-covered trees. Then they saw it. Up ahead was another group. 6 white men and a boy, all armed with rifles, stood in their path, having guessed what they were up to. But Frank spoke to the leader coolly and calmly. He was hoping that they might think that they were a group of freedmen heading up north on a holiday. But the men demanded proof, and a few of them started coming around the carriage to surround them. Frank realized that they would be taken in no matter what he said. So quickly, he drew out his pistol. Then, everyone else in the carriage was watching him closely and also drew out their pistols and knives. There was a bit of confusion among the challengers. They had never known a slave to challenge them with a gun, let alone speak back to them. So, one of them decided that it was probably a good idea to raise his gun as well, thinking that maybe they could still be brought into submission through fear. He pointed his gun right at Emily, but then she just stood up and yelled at him, egging him on, saying, "Shoot, shoot, shoot!" At the same time, Emily made sure that the man could see down her double-barreled gun. Frank turned to the leader and pulled the hammer back on his pistol. He was not about to be sent south. He was ready for a deadly duel. It was 6 on 6. The boy had backed away, and the 2 slaves on horseback had caught up and were ready to empty their guns and trample anyone who stood in their path. For a moment, Frank must have thought that this was the end. But then the rifles slowly lowered, and the men moved off to the side, and Frank moved the carriage forward. They could probably beat 1 or 2 of them, but not all 6, not all with guns. Frank quickly set the horses on the move. He wanted to create as much distance between him and them before somebody decided to change their mind and start shooting at them. Sure enough, as they were on their way and went around the bend, they heard gunshots. Then Frank realized the horses were nowhere in sight. They weren't shooting at the carriage or at him, they were shooting at his friends. But it was too late. The next morning, there was a newspaper that read that 1 slave had been shot in the back and 5 had escaped, though Frank had never seen that 5th come out. The 4 remaining travelers went on for several more days, cold and almost freezing to death. But then they rejoiced because they were now free in the state of Pennsylvania. A bit of creative license was taken in the making of this video, so click on the link in the description for William Still's full report. Comment also below to talk about who your favorite character was and what part of the story you liked the most, and click on this video here for another Underground Railroad escape.